The silence that follows a funeral in a house like this doesn't feel empty. It feels heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm. My name is Eleanor Vance. For 30 years, I served as the state senior auditor, a forensic financial specialist whose entire career was built on tracing hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and looking past polite lies to find the cold, hard numbers beneath. But yesterday, I buried my husband, Arthur, after a grueling 2-year battle with an illness that slowly drained him. And today, I am learning that the most devastating fraud isn't committed by strangers in corporate boardrooms. It is being orchestrated right inside my own living room by my only son. The guests have all gone. The mountains of condolences, the casseroles left on the kitchen counter, and the forced handshakes have faded into the quiet expanse of our $4 million estate, nestled in the rolling hills of Napa Valley, California. I stand by the grand stone fireplace, my fingers resting on the mantelpiece, watching the two people who share my blood moving through my home not like grieving family members, but like appraisers at a liquidation sale. My 38-year-old son, Julian, stands by the western wall of the drawing room. His eyes are not red from crying, they are sharp, calculating, tracking the light hitting the oil paintings we collected in France decades ago. In his right hand, he holds a small metal tape measure. Click. The metal extends. He measures the span of the wall, muttering figures under his breath to his wife, Chloe. Chloe doesn't even bother wearing black. She wears a bright, expensive linen dress, her heels clicking aggressively against the imported hardwood floors as she snaps orders at our aging housekeeper, Martha, telling her to throw away Arthur's favorite leather armchair because it clashes with the modern aesthetic. She pauses by Arthur's private study, pushing the heavy oak door wide open, her voice carrying clearly across the vaulted ceilings. We'll rip this whole room out by Tuesday, knock down this wall, install floor-to-ceiling glass, and I'll finally have enough space for my walk-in seasonal wardrobe. They aren't mourning, they are measuring. For the past 3 years, ever since Arthur's diagnosis, Julian's visits stopped being about his father and started revolving around one single question: what happens to the estate when he's gone? They assumed that because I am a 65-year-old widow, I would crumble into grief, lose track of reality, and let them sweep in to take whatever they pleased. They thought grief made people blind. They forgot who raised them. I do not say a word. I pick up a silver tray, walk into the kitchen, rinse a few empty water glasses under the tap, and watch the water swirl down the drain. I let them pace, let them whisper, let them map out their greedy little futures across my floorboards. The real performance begins the next morning at precisely 7 a.m. The heavy oak door of my private bedroom swings open without a knock. Julian and Chloe march in carrying 3 flattened cardboard boxes and a roll of packing tape. They don't look at me with hesitation or remorse. Julian drops the boxes onto my Persian rug with a dull thud that vibrates through the floorboards. Julian crosses his arms, looking down at me with a cold, business-like smirk that I used to see on white-collar criminals cornered during an audit. "Let's be adults about this, Mom," Julian says, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "You can't possibly maintain a $4.5 million estate on your own. Dad's medical bills wiped out whatever savings you had, and let's be honest, neither of you ever brought in enough independent wealth to keep this place afloat without grandfather's initial backing decades ago. Chloe and I sold our cramped condo in San Francisco this morning. We've moved our things into the guest wing. This house belongs to us now." Chloe steps up beside him, her lips curled into a patronizing smile. "We're actually being very generous, Eleanor. We already found a place for you. It's an extended stay motel off the highway in Vallejo, $650 a month, month to month. We even paid the first week's rent for you. You can take your clothes, your personal papers, and whatever fits in your car. If you need somewhere to sleep before you leave today, you can go stay out in the old glass greenhouse in the back garden. It gets warm when the sun hits it. They hand me a printed brochure for a decaying roadside motel with flickering neon signs and a parking lot full of rusted pickup trucks. They look at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for the trembling voice, the desperate maternal pleas of a broken old woman clinging to her home. They want me to break. They want me to crawl. I do not blink. My face remains as smooth and unreadable as polished marble. For 40 years, my job was to unearth concealed ledgers and catch liars at the exact moment they thought they had secured their loot. I look at my son, this stranger I raised, and I see every miscalculation he has just made. He thinks he has seized total victory. He doesn't realize he's just walked straight into a cage. Slowly, methodically, I open my closet. I pull down my late husband's favorite wool blend coat, the one he wore on our wedding anniversary, and fold it with absolute precision. I place it inside my vintage leather suitcase. I do not raise my voice. I do not curse them. I simply walk past them toward the front door, stopping just at the threshold where Julian and Chloe stand side by side, radiating triumph. I turn my head slightly, looking back into the house I built, and then straight into my son's expectant eyes. I let out a low, quiet breath and deliver the only words I have left for them today. Enjoy the house, Julian, because it will be the most expensive prison sentence of your life. Without waiting for their confusion to turn into panic, I step out into the crisp morning air, close the front door behind me with a soft, final click, and get into my car. The engine turns over smoothly. As I drive down the long, oak-lined driveway, I don't look back in sorrow. I look forward with the cold, sharp focus of a predator preparing to close the trap. The drive from Napa to Vallejo took exactly 42 minutes. But it felt like crossing into another dimension. The extended stay motel my son had so graciously selected for me sat wedged between a rusted-out gas station and a roaring interstate. Room 114. Pushing the flimsy, water-damaged door open, I was hit by a wall of industrial bleach, the kind they use to scrub away decades of cheap cigarette smoke and desperate decisions. Above the bed, a yellowed air conditioning unit rattled violently, sputtering out lukewarm air that smelled faintly of highway exhaust. I set my vintage leather suitcase onto the sagging mattress. A normal mother might have sat on the edge of that bed and wept. She might have looked at the peeling wallpaper and wondered how 40 years of sacrifice, love, and motherhood had reduced her to this. I didn't cry. My eyes were completely dry. My mind was already categorizing the variables of a brand new audit. I unlatched the suitcase, bypassing my neatly folded sweaters, and pulled out the heavy, worn leather jacket that belonged to my husband. It still smelled of cedar and his favorite aftershave. 3 years ago, right after Arthur received his terminal diagnosis, he handed me a small brass key. Arthur had made his fortune as a venture capitalist, a man who engineered corporate buyouts from the shadows, preferring to remain a ghost in the financial world. He had told me exactly which bank vault to visit and precisely when to go. "Not until the day before the funeral, Eleanor," he had whispered from his hospital bed, his grip surprisingly strong. "Wait until you see how they look at the house." I had followed his instructions. Yesterday morning, while Julian was busy picking out a black suit he bought with my credit card, I was sitting in a private viewing room at Chase Bank. Now, standing in this dingy Vallejo room, I reached into the deep inside lining of Arthur's jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed in dark burgundy wax. I broke the seal. The paper inside felt thick and expensive. I spread the documents across the cheap laminate table next to the window, the neon light from the motel sign washing over the ink. First was a property deed, but it wasn't for the house in Napa. It was for a private oceanfront eco-resort down in Carmel by the sea. I scanned the appraisal attached to the back. $14 million. I ran my finger over the ownership line. It was listed entirely under my maiden name, an inheritance from my grandfather that I had legally shielded in a closed trust before Arthur and I ever signed a marriage certificate. Julian had no idea it existed. He thought the Napa estate was all we had. Next came the bank statements. While Julian was busy complaining that his father's medical bills were draining us dry, Arthur had been quietly liquidating his venture capital assets. Offshore investment accounts, anonymous blind trusts, high-yield municipal bonds. I tallied the columns in my head, a reflex from 30 years as a state auditor. $21 million. Combined with the Carmel property, I was staring at $35 million in untraceable, completely secure assets that my son could never touch. But the most important piece of paper wasn't a bank statement. It was a single sheet of Arthur's personal stationery, covered in his sharp, sloping handwriting. "Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this in a cheap motel, it means I was right, and you were right to suspect Julian. I didn't want to believe our son had been hollowed out by Chloe's greed, transformed into a fortune hunter waiting for me to die. I leave the final decision entirely in your hands. Do not let him have our legacy. Teach him a lesson with that auditor's brain of yours. Make it hurt." I read Arthur's final words 3 times, tracing the ink with my thumb. The rattling air conditioner hummed in the background, a stark contrast to the quiet luxury of the home I had just been thrown out of. My son had evicted me over a house he thought was worth millions, throwing me away for pennies, completely blind to the empire sitting right under his nose. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the burgundy envelope, and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dim room. I pulled up my encrypted contact list and found the private cell phone number for Harrison Vance. Harrison wasn't family. He was the chief legal counsel for the state trust fund, one of the most ruthless financial attorneys on the West Coast, and an old friend who owed Arthur his career. The phone rang twice before Harrison's deep, steady voice crackled through the speaker, confirming what I already knew. He had been expecting my call, well aware of the trap Arthur and I had laid years ago. I didn't waste time shedding tears or seeking sympathy. Instead, I leaned over the laminate table, reading the routing numbers, trust identification codes, and legal clauses directly from Arthur's documents with the icy, unyielding precision of a senior state auditor initiating an investigation against corporate fraud. Harrison didn't interrupt with useless questions. The familiar, rapid scratching of his pen was all the confirmation I needed as I dictated the exact timestamps of our blind trusts. Julian was going to try to leverage the Napa house. When he did, I wanted the trap armed. "We're officially opening file number 09, Harrison's voice finally came through, flat and absolute. I closed the laptop. The motel room was freezing, smelling faintly of bleach and highway exhaust fumes, but for the first time since Arthur died, I felt completely awake, my mind sharp and unclouded by grief. As I looked out at the flashing neon sign of the highway, I whispered the only thought that mattered. Julian thinks he's the smartest person in the room. He's about to learn what happens when you try to audit the auditor. The celebration at the Napa estate was already in full swing, echoing through empty rooms that used to hold warmth. Julian and Chloe didn't waste a single afternoon settling into their newly conquered domain. By sunset, the heavy oak front doors were propped wide open to let in the noise of a catered housewarming party. Friends from San Francisco's tech and fashion circles filled the formal dining room, clinking champagne glasses over the marble island where Arthur and I used to share quiet morning coffees. From where I sat miles away in my cramped motel room, I didn't need to be there to picture the scene. Chloe was walking through the house like a queen, inspecting her newly conquered territories, directing movers where to haul away decades of family history. Arthur's mahogany bookcase, filled with the journals and legal histories he spent a lifetime collecting, was hauled out to the front porch and stacked by the curb like trash. In its place went oversized, neon-accented abstract art and minimalist velvet couches that looked more like a modern hotel lobby than a home. They were high on the intoxicating fumes of ownership, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was hollow. Behind closed doors, the real pressure was already mounting. Chloe's newly launched designer boutique in downtown San Francisco was bleeding cash faster than an open artery, accumulating losses close to six figures. At the same time, a high-risk cryptocurrency startup that Julian had bet his entire life savings on had just suffered a catastrophic market crash. They were drowning in liquid debt, and the $4.5 million Napa estate was the only asset left standing that could save them from total ruin. 2 days after I left, my cell phone buzzed on the laminate table of my Vallejo motel room. It was Julian. He didn't bother calling to check if I was alive or settled. His voice came through the speaker, tight, arrogant, and laced with absolute contempt. He told me that my stubbornness had accomplished nothing, that the house was legally theirs, and that I was officially locked out of every family asset forever. He warned me never to call again, gloating that they were walking down to the commercial bank the very next morning to pull $2 million out of the property's equity. I let him finish his little speech, listening to the hollow confidence in his tone. When he finally paused, waiting for me to break down in tears, I didn't raise my voice. I gave him the only sentence he deserved. "You've just signed your own financial death warrant, Julian." Before he could demand an explanation, I tapped the red button and ended the call. While Julian was drafting loan applications, Harrison Vance and I were quietly moving pieces across a chessboard he couldn't even see. Down at the Napa County Superior Court, Harrison filed a comprehensive legal injunction backed by an ironclad paper trail that had been sealed for 40 years. People always assume that a home bought during a marriage automatically belongs to whoever lives in it. They forget the meticulous precautions of a forensic auditor and a cautious investor. 40 years ago, before Arthur and I ever uttered our wedding vows, we signed a rigorous prenuptial and independent asset agreement. That document explicitly quarantined the Napa estate under a family trust structure, entirely managed and controlled by my individual signature. Julian's name was nowhere on the foundational deed. He was a secondary heir to a conditional legacy, not an immediate owner with independent transfer rights. Under California civil and federal lending codes, walking into a commercial bank and attempting to leverage a property you do not hold absolute, unencumbered title to is not just a civil dispute. When you forge or misrepresent trust-bound collateral for a multi-million-dollar loan, it crosses a very sharp, very dangerous legal line. It becomes aggravated mortgage fraud, a federal felony. Harrison worked with the precision of a surgeon. He compiled the bank applications Julian had submitted, cross-referenced them with the trust documents, and attached the original prenuptial deed bearing my verified seal. By Thursday afternoon, the package was complete, stamped, and approved by the district prosecutor's office. The first major twist of our campaign didn't arrive with a warning letter or a polite phone call. It arrived at 8 o'clock on Saturday night, right in the middle of Julian and Chloe's second night of celebrating their apparent triumph. The doorbell rang over the sound of thumping electronic music. Julian, holding a glass of vintage Pinot Noir, swung the door open, expecting another couple from Chloe's boutique. Instead, he found the county sheriff's captain standing on the porch, flanked by 2 deputies, holding a thick manila envelope bearing the court's official red stamp. It wasn't just a routine eviction notice. It was a comprehensive federal and civil subpoena. The documents ordered an immediate halt to all pending mortgage loan applications, froze every single personal checking and savings account belonging to Julian and Chloe due to fraudulent asset representation, and slapped an emergency preservation lien on the Napa estate. The house they thought they owned was suddenly locked down under court jurisdiction as evidence in a federal fraud investigation. Julian stood frozen on his own porch, his glass slipping from his fingers to shatter against the imported tiles, watching his guests slowly back away into the night. The Napa County Superior Courtroom was quiet, save for the rhythmic clicking of the wall clock and the rustle of heavy legal briefs. It was a space designed to strip away pretense, governed by Judge David Sterling, a man whose reputation for financial law was as unyielding as iron. He didn't care about family drama, he cared exclusively about the paper trail, the statutes, and the cold truth of contracts. When the oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, the contrast could not have been starker. Julian and Chloe sat at the defense table, flanked by a nervous, fresh-faced public defender turned corporate associate, whose cheap synthetic suit looked entirely out of place under the high ceilings. Their faces were pale, drained of the arrogant color they wore during their weekend parties. Julian stared fixedly at the polished mahogany surface of the table, his fingers twitching nervously. I walked through those doors alone, dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, my posture upright, stepping forward with the steady, measured rhythm of someone who had spent decades reviewing state-level audits and standing before grand juries. I didn't look at them as I took my seat beside Harrison. I looked straight ahead at the bench. The proceedings began precisely at 9 o'clock. There were no emotional greetings, no theatrical speeches. Harrison stood up, his voice calm, resonant, and absolute, laying out the factual foundation of our case with the surgical precision of an experienced litigator. He didn't need to yell. He simply handed the court clerk 3 definitive pieces of evidence: the 1984 prenuptial agreement that legally ring-fenced the estate under independent trust structures, the meticulous ledger statements proving the trust's origin, and the exact signed loan application where Julian had unlawfully pledged a property he did not own to a commercial bank for $2 million in liquid cash. The exhibits were projected on the courtroom screens in stark black and white. Every signature, every date, every clause stood exposed. For nearly an hour, their defense counsel scrambled to object, stammering about family rights and implied domestic inheritance, but each argument was systematically dismantled by Judge Sterling with a single nod or a sharp reference to state property codes. Realizing that the law was entirely against them and watching their fragile legal lifeline dissolve into dust, the fragile control Chloe had been maintaining finally snapped. She stood up abruptly from the defense table, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, her voice piercing the quiet solemnity of the room. "She's my mother. She gave birth to us, yet she's sitting there orchestrating this entire nightmare just to destroy her own flesh and blood. She's manipulating the law out of pure malice." Judge Sterling didn't even let her finish the sentence. The heavy wooden gavel came down on the sound block with a sharp, explosive crack that echoed off the walls. "Counsel, control your client immediately," Judge Sterling warned, his voice cold and sharp as a blade. "One more outburst of contempt from that table, and I will have her removed in handcuffs. Sit down, Mrs. Vance." Chloe sank back into her seat, trembling, her face flushed with humiliation as silent tears of frustration leaked down her cheeks. Julian didn't look up to comfort her. He remained frozen, staring at his hands as the reality of what he had engineered finally closed in around him. Judge Sterling adjusted his glasses, picked up a pen, and reviewed the final summary sheet submitted by Harrison. He looked up from the bench, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom before locking directly on the defense table. When the judge delivered his ruling, every single word was spoken with slow, deliberate clarity that left no room for appeal or misinterpretation. "The court has reviewed all primary deeds, trust documents, and financial disclosures submitted under seal," Judge Sterling announced, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "The evidence confirms beyond any doubt that the defendants attempted to leverage an estate explicitly quarantined under an independent, multi-decade family trust. Furthermore, locking a legal resident and rightful trust controller out of a property without due process constitutes an illegal lockout under civil statutes." He paused, letting the heavy silence settle over the room before delivering the final blow. "The court hereby declares the mortgage application entirely null and void. All temporary occupancy privileges granted to the defendants are revoked with immediate effect. They are ordered to vacate the Napa estate within 48 hours, removing only their personal clothing and effects. Furthermore, due to the deliberate misrepresentation of trust-bound collateral, this court is formally transferring all case files to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation regarding charges of aggravated mortgage fraud. The finality of the decision hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the wooden gavel struck one last time, ringing out like a sharp, definitive cut of fate. The sound seemed to strip away whatever strength Julian had left. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He simply slid forward out of his chair, collapsing onto the carpeted aisle between the benches, his hands gripping his head as his entire world fractured completely. Chloe broke down into loud, choking sobs, her hands covering her face as she realized the horrifying truth. They hadn't just lost a house they never truly owned. They'd walked straight into a trap of their own making, leaving them entirely bankrupt, stripped of their social standing, and staring down the barrel of a federal criminal indictment. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, gathering my documents, slipping each page back into my leather folder with calm, deliberate movements. I didn't smile down at them. I didn't offer a word of gloating. I simply closed my folder, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom doors into the bright California sunlight, leaving the consequences to catch up with them on their own terms. Desperation is a violent counselor. When legal avenues closed and the federal fraud indictments began closing in around them, Julian and Chloe realized they were facing absolute ruin. Refusing to accept the reality of their own actions, they pivoted to a strategy born of pure panic and malice. Through a shady referral network, they hired a fast-talking attorney who specialized in manufacturing technicalities. Within days, they constructed a dirty narrative designed to bypass the civil rulings entirely. They tracked down a desperate, debt-ridden acquaintance, paying him off to step into the courtroom as a paid perjurer. His assignment was simple, yet devastating: to stand before a judge and falsely testify that I, at 65 years old, was suffering from severe cognitive decline, memory loss, and age-induced paranoia even before my husband passed away. Under this fabricated medical claim, Julian filed an emergency petition to freeze my independent assets and seize legal guardianship over me. They thought they could legally erase me. They thought vulnerability was something they could invent and weaponize. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon outside a quiet grocery store in downtown Napa. I had just loaded my groceries into the trunk when Julian's black sedan pulled up sharply, blocking me in. He stepped out, slamming the door, his face twisted with a frantic, unhinged fury. The confident swagger from the courtroom was completely gone, replaced by the desperation of a cornered animal. He cornered me against my car door, his voice hissing with venom. "If you don't drop the criminal complaints right now, I will destroy your reputation across this entire state. I'll drag your name through the mud, paint you as a senile old lunatic, and lock you away in a state-run nursing home where no one will ever find you." I didn't flinch. My expression remained entirely cold, stripped of any maternal warmth or fear. My right hand, tucked safely inside my deep coat pocket, had already quietly pressed the record button on my smartphone the moment I saw his car pull up. I looked straight into his panicked eyes and delivered my reply with absolute calm. Every word of that threat was just transmitted directly to the Napa Police Department and the district attorney's office. "Good luck with your next indictment, Julian." Before he could process what he had heard, I slipped past him, got into my car, and drove away. The final showdown took place 2 weeks later in a packed appellate courtroom. Julian's attorney arrived looking confident, brandishing the paid perjurer's affidavit like a silver bullet, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs or hold trust assets. Harrison didn't even blink. He didn't waste time arguing subjective opinions with their witness. Instead, he calmly stepped forward and submitted two pieces of evidence that completely pulverized their entire fabrication. First, he handed the bench a comprehensive certified neurological evaluation issued just 48 hours prior by the State Institute of Neurosciences. It was a rigorous, multi-page clinical assessment proving beyond any medical doubt that my cognitive processing speed, logical deduction, and memory retention were operating at peak perfection, far sharper than the average person half my age. Before the judge could even look up from the medical report, Harrison turned to the financial records. He exposed the paper trail linking Julian's personal account to the perjured witness, presenting the exact wire transfers, text messages, and cash payments that proved the entire guardianship claim was a malicious, manufactured fraud. And then Harrison played the final card. With a single tap on his laptop, the courtroom speakers crackled to life. The audio recording of Julian's threat in the grocery store parking lot echoed clearly off the high ceilings. Every harsh word, every blackmail attempt, every ruthless threat to lock me away in a nursing home played out in excruciating detail for everyone in the room to hear. The courtroom fell into a dead, heavy silence. The perjured witness lowered his head and silently slipped out the back doors before the deputies even looked his way. Julian's lawyer sat frozen, staring at his files in utter disbelief, realizing he had been dragged into a conspiracy of criminal obstruction. Judge Sterling didn't even bother listening to their closing statements. The weight of the evidence spoke with brutal clarity. When the judge issued his final ruling, his voice was laced with profound judicial contempt. He didn't just reject Julian's guardianship petition as a malicious abuse of the legal system, he escalated the consequences immediately. The court finds clear and convincing evidence of bad faith, perjury, and calculated manipulation, Judge Sterling announced, his gavel striking the block with an authoritative blow. Furthermore, the recorded audio established a blatant, undeniable case of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. He paused, his eyes fixed coldly on the defense table. Bail is revoked. Take him into custody. Before Julian could even stammer out a defense, two county deputies stepped forward from the shadows of the courtroom. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed through the silence as they locked around Julian's wrists. He didn't fight back. His legs buckled slightly as he was pulled up from his chair and escorted out through the side doors towards the county holding facility, where he would await a consolidated criminal trial alongside his fraud charges. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her muffled cries lost in the empty expanse of the gallery as she realized the full, terrifying extent of what they had brought upon themselves. I stood up slowly, smoothing the lapels of my coat, and walked out of the courtroom. The air outside was crisp, clean, and entirely free of shadows. True consequences do not arrive with dramatic courtroom explosions. They settle in slowly, grinding down the spirit until nothing is left of arrogance or illusion. True to the court's strict mandate, exactly 48 hours after the gavel fell, the county sheriff's deputies and court-appointed bailiffs arrived at the iron gates of the Napa estate to enforce the final eviction order. There were no more legal arguments to be made, no more technicalities to exploit, and no more delays to buy. Julian and Chloe were forced to pack their designer clothes, their neon art pieces, and their remaining personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes, the exact same kind of boxes they had so callously dropped onto my bedroom floor weeks before. They were unceremoniously escorted off the property, locked out for good, under the watchful eyes of the law. From that exact moment on, the fragile house of cards they had constructed collapsed entirely under its own crushing weight. With multiple federal felony indictments, a revoked professional license, and a personal credit score that had plummeted straight to the absolute bottom, Julian could no longer hide behind corporate titles, family wealth, or empty prestige. Every commercial bank, private lender, and credit institution closed their doors simultaneously, demanding immediate repayment of outstanding loans. Backed into an inescapable corner with no legal or financial rescue route remaining, Julian was legally forced to file for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy, officially liquidating every remaining scrap of asset he owned. His business credentials and financial licenses were permanently revoked by the state regulatory board, ending his corporate career forever. The descent from a $4.5 million estate to absolute destitution was swift, merciless, and complete. Julian and Chloe had to abandon their high-end San Francisco lifestyle entirely, stripped of every luxury they had taken for granted. They relocated to a cramped subterranean basement apartment wedged between a noisy industrial freight yard and a chemical processing plant in the outskirts of Vallejo, barely a few blocks away from the cheap motel room they once mocked me for staying in. The irony was absolute, carved straight out of the unyielding reality of cause and effect. To survive and begin chipping away at the crushing mountain of legal fees, court-mandated restitution fines, and mounting debt, their daily routine transformed beyond recognition. Chloe spent her mornings scrubbing floors and cleaning commercial restrooms as an hourly janitorial cleaner for a commercial property management firm, her designer heels replaced by heavy, worn-out rubber work boots. Julian spent his days hauling heavy shipping crates in a freezing, dimly lit logistics warehouse, his hands calloused and blistered from grueling manual labor that tested every single limit of his physical endurance. They were trapped at the very bottom of the social ladder they had spent years trying to climb through shortcuts, entitlement, and betrayal. Weeks bled into months as the criminal proceedings marched steadily toward their inevitable conclusion. Then, on a quiet Thursday evening, while I was sitting by my desk reviewing some quiet financial statements, my laptop screen lit up with a notification. A lengthy email from Chloe, accompanied by a frantic, broken text message notification from Julian's registered legal number. I opened the email first. It was a long, emotional wall of text filled with ragged sentences and defensive justifications, describing the misery of their daily existence, the biting cold of their subterranean apartment, and the physical exhaustion of manual labor. Right beneath it, Julian's short message flashed across the screen, stripped of all arrogance, filled with raw, choking desperation. "Mom, we've lost everything. The debt is crushing us, and we finally realize how completely our own greed destroyed our lives. Please, Rue Long Thurn, have mercy on us." I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop for a long, quiet moment. I didn't smile with malicious triumph, nor did I shed a single tear of maternal sorrow or regret. My heart didn't race with anger, nor did it soften with misplaced pity. Inside me, there was only a profound, unshakable stillness, the calm that follows a storm that has thoroughly cleared the air. With a steady hand on the trackpad, I moved the cursor, clicked the small box marked "Mark as Read," and closed the laptop lid. I didn't type a single word in reply. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to negotiate, and no space left for empty apologies born solely out of punishment. As I turned my head to look out through the glass pane, the golden evening sunlight was spilling gracefully across the horizon of Napa Valley, painting the rolling hills in warm, enduring hues. I understood then something the law books and audit ledgers could never quite capture. True closure doesn't come from watching people suffer, nor does it come from accepting crocodile tears offered only when the consequences finally strike home. Forgiveness cannot be bought with the currency of regret when character has already rotted at its core. Karma is not a punishment inflicted by others. It is simply the natural, unyielding law of life, teaching those who refuse to listen that arrogance is a debt that always, without exception, collects its principal in full. I walked away from the screen, knowing the story was finally complete. We spend so much of our lives trying to protect the walls we built, forgetting that sometimes the greatest act of liberation is simply walking away from the ruins. I knew I could no longer stay in the Napa estate. Even with all the legal battles won and the physical reminders of my children's betrayal cleared away, the shadows remained. Every hallway whispered of broken trust, and every corner held the heavy echo of entitlement. I decided to make a clean, irreversible break. Through a discreet, cash-only transaction, I listed and sold the Napa property for $4.8 million, closing the entire escrow process in under 3 weeks. I didn't want to keep a monument built on old illusions or hold on to a space stained by deceit. I wanted a fresh start in a place that belonged solely to me, quiet, clean, and entirely untethered from the past. I packed my personal essentials and relocated to Carmel by the Sea, a stunning coastal sanctuary nestled between ancient pine forests and the crashing, wind-swept waves of the Pacific Ocean. It was a place Arthur and I had visited decades ago during our earlier years, a peaceful haven where he had always dreamed of spending his retirement. The cottage I chose sat right on the edge of the coastline, surrounded by salt air, towering cypress trees, and the endless, rhythmic beating of the tide against the rocky cliffs. Here, the world moved at a completely different, healing pace, far away from the chaotic noise of corporate greed, courtroom drama, and family betrayal. With my independent assets secured and the proceeds from the estate sales safely channeled into private accounts, I chose to build something enduring and meaningful out of the wreckage of the past. I established the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Foundation, an educational scholarship endowment dedicated entirely to supporting hardworking students in law and financial auditing who came from modest backgrounds but showed an unyielding dedication to professional ethics and strict integrity. I wanted to ensure that the principles my husband and I lived by would help lift up those who honored the truth rather than those who sought to exploit the system for personal gain. My daily routine became a quiet, beautiful study in intentional, mindful living. I spent my mornings planting a long row of delicate white roses along the weathered wooden porch of the cottage, watching the soft morning mist roll in from the ocean. I learned to brew herbal teas at sunrise, sitting quietly by the window with a blank journal, letting the absolute silence restore what noise and deception had tried to tear down. There were no rushed phone calls, no manipulative demands, and no hidden agendas. There was only the steady, grounding rhythm of inner peace. On a bright Tuesday afternoon in mid-October, I celebrated my 66th birthday in absolute tranquility. There was no grand party, no crowded room of sycophants, and no performative family gatherings. I sat completely alone on the wide wooden deck of my coastal home, wrapped in a soft cashmere shawl, looking out across the vast, rolling expanse of the Pacific Ocean as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon. In my hand, I held a crystal glass filled with a crisp, chilled glass of white wine, raising it quietly toward the wind in a silent toast to Arthur's enduring memory. As I watched the golden light dance across the cresting waves, the final pieces of my life's journey fell into place with absolute clarity. Life can sometimes strip away your youth, your comfort, and your trust, leaving you to reckon with the pain of a misplaced heart. But it cannot touch your core. Clarity of mind, unwavering self-respect, and quiet inner strength remain the most impenetrable armor a person can ever wear through the storms of life. When you finally learn to stand completely on your own 2 feet, refusing to be broken by the greed and malice of others, loneliness ceases to be an empty void. It transforms effortlessly and purely into the most absolute, unshakable freedom a human soul can ever know. I took a slow sip of the wine, feeling the cool ocean breeze gently brush against my face, and smiled as I watched the sun slip below the western horizon. The story was over, and for the first time in my life, the horizon was entirely mine.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.